Welcome to the Be Global by Design podcast. My guest today is Kristopher Wilson. Kristopher is one of the founding members of Be Global by Design and is a destination development consultant. Today, we'll be talking about tourism and specifically sustainable tourism as a vehicle for community development. Welcome, Kristopher.
Hi, Kristen. Lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for coming. So tell me, what is tourism as opposed to, I think most people will think tourism is a vacation. What is tourism?
Yeah, and that's not an unpopular interpretation of tourism, right? When you think of tourism, you think of being a tourist. You think of
Sure,
you probably picture going to the beach or a theme park. I know you were just in Florida.
I
That
was
yeah,
at the
that's
beach
at the beach, exactly. And sun
and
and
going
surf.
shopping and, looking at all the local handicrafts and all that stuff. Yeah.
Beautiful, and I mean, that is the action of tourism, but, tourism, the development practice is a little bit different. So, tourism is often called an industry. That's true, but also a little bit misleading. So, it represents
Okay.
approximately 10% of global GDP, but I think
That's
it's
huge.
best. It is huge, and I think it's not necessarily on the front of everyone's radar, but I think it's best understood as a cross-cutting system rather than
Okay.
necessarily a discrete industry because it touches on a bunch of other sectors, right? Transportation, land use, workforce and labor, conservation, culture, infrastructure, all of these things that are much more neatly kind of put into a box, right?
Okay.
Tourism is a connective tissue between all of these different things. So if you have all of these other different things working together, it's almost like you get to activate this extra special layer of economic and social activity on top of everything else that's going hopefully well. Does that make sense?
That does make sense. So what you're saying basically is that it's a sector, it's a system because it touches on different industries, different communities. It impacts us in different ways. Is that right? Or is there more to that?
Yeah, so no, I mean that's right. I would say it's probably best to conceptualize it as like a connective tissue or maybe a platform that other sectors can run on. So you've got governments and destination management organizations that will set policy, private operators delivering experiences. So that's where, you're like most everyone is going to interface with the tourism sector is being a tourist. You have communities acting
Huh?
as stakeholders and stewards, and then you have institutions sometimes funding strategy and researchers that are generating the data that guides decisions. So the visitor is really just one node in a broader system, and what determines outcomes in tourism is kind of how all of those layers communicate, align, ideally share resources where possible. And that's a design question, I think, more than anything else.
Interesting. So what does then in this context, what does sustainable tourism mean?
Right. And I'm glad that you asked that because the word sustainable is like a pretty sexy buzzword these days, right? It gets tossed around a lot. I think the best way to conceptualize it is that there are three core pillars. So there's
Okay.
environmental, there's economic, and there's sociocultural sustainability. So in practice, what makes sustainable tourism sustainable is that it asks a pretty simple question at its core, and that's, does a destination remain viable and livable for the people who actually live there? Are the
Okay.
residents benefiting? And is the natural and cultural heritage of a destination intact for the next generation? So, I mean, it's less of like a discrete certification. I mean, there are sustainability certifications, don't get me wrong, but
Yeah.
it's less
Okay.
about like the straight up certification and more of a design orientation. A lot of destinations have sustainability policies on paper and extractive realities on the ground, and that gap is almost always a governance problem.
It sounds like what you're saying basically is you do hear these stories with beaches that get overused or, towns that turn into tourist towns and it prices out the people who actually live there, or respecting kind of your cultural artifacts or that people are coming to visit with that, managing that in a way that's sustainable and good for the community who owns those assets. Kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key word here is intentionality, right?
Okay.
So tourism activity can absolutely take place without, any sort of design behind it. It's really the design element that defines whether or not tourism, you know, becomes a extractive phenomenon, or it can become, a net benefit for a destination, potentially even regenerative, which is sort of the next step beyond sustainability. So really being intentional about the alignment of your different stakeholders, your community, your governance, your stewardship, making sure that all of the different entities that go into a visitor economy are really aligned, and they understand, what the objectives are, what the goals are, and also what the limits are. That's a key component as well. I think really sort of defines, whether or not the tourism activity is beneficial and sustainable.
And how is this the same or different than regenerative tourism?
So the difference between regenerative and sustainable isn't just sort of like a rebrand. Those terms aren't
Okay.
synonymous, though they do get tossed around a lot as if they were synonymous. So sustainable means doing no harm, maintaining what
Mhm.
exists. That can be ecological systems, local economies, cultural practices. Regenerative means actively restoring.
Okay.
So kind of rebuilding from sort of that sustainability base. So, for example, some trail work that I was doing recently, I think is a good
Okay.
example of regenerative tourism, right? So you're using
Uh-huh.
tourism incentives in developing trail infrastructures to connect landscapes with their communities in ways that maybe
Okay.
they had been historically separated. Kind of you're removing that urban rural barrier that often exists in modern life. So the communities are developing from are benefiting from a form of community development that's connecting them back to their land, rather than just managing visitor impact. I mean, they are, and that's certainly a benefit, but at the heart of it is the destination itself is the beneficiary. So that being said, I do get a little bit cautious when destinations
Yeah.
reach for regenerative language before they have the basics of sustainability, right? It can be
Yeah.
kind of a way of skipping the hard work, but you do have to walk before you run. So I would say sustainability needs to be the foundation, and regenerative can be like the aspiration.
An add-on kind of. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think that most people, you know, you pointed out 10% of GDP worldwide comes from tourism. So this is seen as an economic growth strategy.
Uh-huh.
But what you're saying is that it can also be a cultural, a social connector, a natural, a physical, and other assets that can develop those assets within a community. So, from the perspective of a community, why would they want to develop a tourism strategy?
Yeah. Well, I would say sometimes the answer is that communities don't. So I'll say that
Oh,
first. So the first thing when you're doing uh well, I guess saying no to tourism, I guess, is in itself a development strategy, but the important thing is to lead with the community in any sort of sustainable development practice. Why a community might potentially want to encourage tourism, however, is because tourism done well is a value chain activator, right?
okay.
A visitor dollar doesn't just pass through a community, it circulates, right? So your restaurants might buy from your local farm, your employees shop at a local market. The tourism guide might reinvest their equipment or reinvest in their equipment from a local outfitter. This is called the multiplier effect, and it's real, and it compounds when the ecosystem is designed for local circulation. But this is done intentionally at a community level. There are forms of tourism development that are a little bit more contained. That could be characterized as more extractive. So, for example, you have all-inclusive resorts are
Mhm.
notorious for this. Cruise ships
Huh?
are notorious for this as well. They have kind of their contained they capture all of the gains of this circulation, and they often send them elsewhere, right? So those cruise
Yeah.
ships will send them to wherever those cruise ship corporations are headquartered,
Headquarters.
right? The individual island
Sure.
destinations, usually island destinations that they're stopping in, or smaller communities might not see that benefit of the multiplier effect. They also might have their infrastructure overwhelmed and their resources tapped at a level that they wouldn't tap naturally just themselves.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, having a tourism strategy allows places to kind of understand that there is a benefit to tourism activity if done well, if it done proportionally, and if done intentionally. And it also helps kind of right size what that strategy would look like and at what scale, right? So I said earlier, I think I led with some communities might say no, or some communities might put limits. And that's a really important part of what makes tourism sustainable is understanding uh, the limits of acceptable change, right? Having the dialogue with the stakeholders and understanding that yes, we can get an amazing benefit from tourism activity in our destinations, in our communities, but we do have to understand that tourism activity is a change. It's like inviting guests into your home, right?
Right.
You're not gonna live like you do every day when you're inviting guests. There is a little bit of a trade-off there, but it's for the greater good. You just have to kind of have those conversations, realistic conversations with, what are we willing to change and what's non-negotiable?
Yeah.
So I would say that's primarily why a community would want a tourism growth strategy, understanding that there are benefits, but there are trade-offs and trying to find the happy balance between those two things.
Tourism, I think that there's a endless, you could say, range of what tourism could be, right? Like people are interested in all kinds of different activities and to go places for different reasons. Can you give us some examples from your work in Colombia, Canada, or the Caribbean, or even the rural United States of what types of strategies or what types of tourism these places were using?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting line of inquiry because tourism can be kind of unwieldy as a sector because there are so many different types of tourism, right? So I think when we started, we led with what often gets termed as sun and surf tourism. So like what you were doing in Florida, you were at the beach, it's beautiful. It's so much nicer than it is up here in Michigan in April, right? That's a specific type of tourism activity. There's nature-based tourism, there's sports and events types of tourism, there's cultural heritage tourism. Well, there's a million different types of anything that makes you want to go to a place and experience it is a type of tourism.
I mean, adventure tourism, right? Like
Adventure tourism, right?
Sudan, Afghanistan.
Right, absolutely. And there's things that are tourism that might not necessarily be thought of as tourism. So medical tourism is a really good example of this.
Mhm.
So you have places like
Yeah.
Costa Rica that
Turkey.
sell turkey for I think hair restoration, I think
Mhm.
is the big one in tourism. That's a big one. Pilgrimages, that's one of the oldest and most
Yep.
well-established form of tourism, the Hajj to
Sure.
Mecca.
Yep.
That's a huge one. Let's see what else. There's dark tourism, which is interesting, and this kind of leads into questions of extraction, right? So dark tourism, visiting places that maybe have difficult historical associations. For example, visiting some of the concentration camps in
Yeah.
Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
Or this
So
one
I
is sorry.
yeah, I mean, I'm hoping to eventually I never thought I would wanna do this, but I was in Cambodia a couple of years ago, and it made me wanna go. My dad was a Vietnam veteran, and now I wanna go and see where he was. I wanna do tourism to go and look at what happened.
And I think this really dovetails nicely with that intentionality question that we were talking about, right? Because there are with these types of tourism that I guess you could characterize as dark tourism. The way that it's done really makes the difference between whether or not the process ends up being extractive or potentially benefits the community. Sometimes around those painful historical events, the way that the story is being told and who is telling the story, and whether or not they're able to use, again, tourism as a vehicle for the gains of that storytelling,
Yeah.
and tourism to kind of benefit their local communities, maybe rebuild, is really, really important, right? So, an example and a local example that I like to use of kind of problematic forms of tourism is, we live very close to the city of Detroit, and Detroit for the longest time was the poster child of what has been termed ruin pornography. So you had a lot of people, breaking into buildings, taking photos, and painting Detroit as, making a spectacle out of what was very real human suffering, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, that made Detroit, I mean, and still in a lot of ways, Detroit has a narrative around it, though it's come a long way and it's recovering, but there is kind of like a wider popular narrative that Detroit has been really trying to fight about being this place that is economically impoverished, and, oh, look at, like the houses that are falling into disrepair and the buildings that don't have windows, and it creates a popular image that disincentivizes investment.
Yes. Yes. Storytelling is powerful.
Right, that creates a caricature of a destination and the people who live in this destination and have lived in this destination throughout, this kind of, this arc of economic and human tragedy. But Detroit obviously is a much deeper, richer, more complex, vibrant place than just sort of this wallpapering that's done with through this kind of process, this fundamentally extractive process of making a spectacle through ruin pornography. And so, that's a really good example of what should not be done, I would say.
So tell us a little bit about the project you worked on in Colombia and what worked in that and what seemed to not work in terms of tourism strategy.
Right. So Columbia was a really interesting case. So I was part of designing a program that primary funding came from the United States government, and it was basically sprung from an agreement from the Colombian government and the United States government on assisting Colombia in kind of a post-conflict context. So Colombia has dealt with a civil war for a very long time, decades. It's pretty low grade, but still active and highly fragmented across its geography, right? And in 2016, there were peace accords signed with certain rebel groups in the sort of the eastern and southeastern, sort of central provinces of Colombia. And part of the agreement was that the central government of Colombia was going to help provide economic opportunity for these splinter groups
Okay.
that were until recently up in arms with the Colombian government. And I love this example because it's so illustrative of the transformative power of tourism. In so the kind of the dirty secret about conflict is that as long as there's not, it's all out war, total war, conflict can actually be really great for the environment because a lot of that extractive activity that would otherwise be occurring is not taking place because it's not safe. So a good example is
Okay.
gold mining in the Amazon. Right? These mining companies aren't gonna come in and clear cut the forest, or and the process for gold extraction could be really detrimental to the environment as well. Mercury can end up in water sources. None of that takes place if, it's not necessarily worth the risk to these companies. So Mother Nature gets this really wonderful opportunity to regenerate, to restore herself, even if there's just horrible human conflict. The environment can heal itself. I think we saw that actually during COVID.
And I was going to
Yeah,
say, COVID, one of the things was they saw species that were on the endangered list come back. And like, yeah, there was a lot of positive environmental impacts of that.
Yes, absolutely. So in these provinces of Colombia that we were in, like they didn't necessarily, sort of like these traditional industries weren't able to take root, especially the large scale ones that they were in other parts of Colombia because of the instability and the conflict. And but the natural environment of these provinces really flourished. And so how this relates to tourism is that again, the central government of Bogota had promised economic development opportunities for these groups. Um, so nature-based tourism, intentional nature-based tourism was an opportunity where we could simultaneously provide economic opportunity for the people in these regions and
Yeah.
incentivize conservation of the environment that had this
Okay.
chance to flourish in the absence of human intervention, right? So we worked, for example, with guides and river rafting. There's a very famous river that's it's famous for being green.
Okay.
Yeah, and so but it's in this, like, very dramatic canyon where, like, waterfalls
Cool.
fall all along the canyon. There's these, they're blue morpho butterflies, these electric blue butterflies that inhabit the canyon. There's a variety of birds, like, it's just spectacular nature, and, the guides were all former rebels against the central government, and so not only did you get to enjoy this spectacular destination and have this amazing sort of adventure experience, but you could have conversations with the tour guides about like, well, tell me about this time in your life, like what made you, like tell me your
Wow.
story, you know?
Cool.
And they got to benefit on their own terms by sharing the story and, making money as well that eventually went back into their communities. What was especially cool about this project is that a lot of the people who lived in this region are indigenous
Okay.
and speak their own languages and have their own cosmologies. And we worked with some of these guides who were using tourism as a way to, again, the storytelling, the sharing, to incentivize the preservation and transmission of their culture, again,
Mhm.
on their terms. So nature walks, for example, would be a really good example where guides can transmit sort of the cosmovision of their people and, incentivize language preservation and language transmission, and also serve as an example to members of their community. One guide, for example, that I spoke to had said that she ended up getting involved with the guerrillas, not the guerrillas in Africa, but
Right. Yeah.
the communist
The
guerrillas
rebels.
in
Yeah.
Colombia, the rebels. She got involved with the guerrillas because there just wasn't any other opportunity in the area, and also being a gorilla was romanticized, right? It was,
Sure.
you're like a hero of your people, you're fighting the oppressor. And of course, being in it, the reality was a lot different. There was drug trafficking, human trafficking,
Yeah.
violence,
Mhm.
sexual and other as
Yeah.
well. It's, a pretty the reality was a lot different.
Sure. Yeah.
And but having kind of an alternative route, she was like, "Now I'm a tour guide and I can preserve and serve my community and her indigenous community in a different way that is
Mhm.
directly relevant, and also I get to be an example for younger people in my community where I
Yeah.
can show them that another route is possible instead of just being, you know, joining the gorillas and then, having this romantic idea and then getting actually into it and finding out that the reality is like quite a departure from what I expected." So again, it seems indirect and it
Mhm.
seems very complicated, but unlocking the tourism potential in this particular region of Colombia was amazing because it was able to incentivize conservation. It seems very indirect in this particular case, but tourism was an amazing vehicle to accomplish all of these objectives in Colombia, provide economic incentive for cultural transmission and preservation as well, and kind of strengthen peace by satisfying the requirements of the peace accord between these rebel groups and the central government. And there was a lot of interest in, both by the community in this project, and there was a lot of intentionality in design. So something that's also really important in that design as well. When you're developing a tourism project, you want to keep in mind the type of tourists that you want to attract, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
yeah, for this Columbia project, there was a lot of I think, residual preconception, let's call it, within the Colombian market. A lot of Colombian travelers themselves, growing up with the conflict, had some preconceptions about traveling to these regions. Maybe it wasn't
Sure.
safe, like maybe we didn't want to do it. Even though it was safe, there's some stereotyping going on, and of course that's understandable. So there was an intentional there was it was an intentional design choice to focus marketing these experiences towards foreign travelers for 2 reasons.
Mm.
1, they didn't come with the historical or cultural baggage as local tourists, and 2, they were higher value tourists, as in they were more likely to spend more money to travel the distance. And the great thing from a nature-based tourism perspective about higher value travelers is that there are less of them. You can make just as much money with less tourists, which means less impact on the natural.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah. So if I'm a small town in the US or a small town somewhere and I'm trying to decide if I want to develop a tourism strategy, where do I start? Like, how do I even decide, like, this is something I should try to do or not?
Well, that to me sounds first like a governance question. There's a couple different ways that you can take this. So the individual level of kind of getting involved in tourism activity, and then there's the governance level of starting with tourism development, which is a
Yeah.
community-centered design question, right? So, I would say a great way to get involved with tourism, first
Hmm.
off, is you're probably involved in it already and you just don't know it, right? Because tourism is a connective tissue between all of these different stakeholders. Leading into your question, I think if you want to be more intentional about placemaking, I think a good way to start to get involved is maybe to get engaged with maybe your local chamber or a downtown development authority, or if your communities don't have one, maybe explore starting one. Tourism development doesn't necessarily always have to start with a government apparatus. You can create
Okay.
an ad hoc groups, like a community interest groups. You can get together with your neighbors and start exploring your own backyard and talking about what do we want our community to look like and how can we have visitation
Sure.
part of how we get from where we are to where we want to be. Now, as that grows, I think it usually starts with the community-centered design usually starts with listening before proposing. Again, having those conversations about, what makes this a great place to live? What makes our community unique? Where do we wanna go as a community, and how can, again, visitation be a part of that process? Stakeholder mapping is pretty fundamental, I would say, and then also understanding who has been excluded from planning processes and why. Because in tourism, those exclusions tend to reproduce themselves unless you
Yeah.
actually disrupt them, right?
And
So
you
and
might
then
be leaving resources on the table if you're not including people who you haven't included before. They have new
absolutely.
ideas.
Absolutely. And co-designing, right? You're like not just presenting a plan for community approval, building one together from the ground up.
Yeah. Yeah. So where do creatives and designers fit into all of this?
Well, I mean, they're everywhere, quite frankly. You know,
Yeah.
like
I
I
mean,
said,
they're well integrated, right? I mean,
yeah, they're
everything from like the ancient art that's being preserved to like street food, tasting culinary arts. Uh,
right. A 1,000%, right? I mean, I don't want to give like if it's everything, it's nothing, right? So I want to be a little bit more specific, but you're totally right. Designers and creatives are already doing tourism work. They probably just don't call it that right? Wayfinding, place branding, visitor experience design, cultural interpretation, community storytelling, product development. You mentioned street vendors selling food. Like that's all part of it. But it is, activating it is a design problem. And and again, it's high stakes. The way that a place is represented shapes who comes, what they expect, and how they behave when they get there. So it's really important that design is at the heart of it because bad design in tourism becomes extractive. It commodifies culture and places without giving anything back. So again, I think the intentionality is really kind of why designers and creatives are fundamental in destination management because good design is a form of stewardship, right? It protects what makes a place worth visiting in the first place. So, yeah.
Let's talk about the impact of we've talked about the economic impact a little bit, but let's hone in a little bit more on like the social impact, the environment. We talked a bit about the environmental impact, but what about like the local social, like the community? How can tourism be something that's a positive? I can see a lot of ways it can be a negative for social outcomes, but there's also ways that it's positive. Can you talk a little bit about those outcomes and the impact and why you would want to consider a tourism strategy?
Yes. So again, tourism is really useful for incentivizing the not just the conservation of nature, but also the conservation and perpetuation of culture. As well, right? So a lot of people come to places because of their distinctiveness, right? And a lot of what makes places distinct is cultural difference, right? So I think we live at a time that has been because of mass media and that's only
Huh?
accelerating, there's kind of been a homogenizing force globally across culture. I mean, there's been transmission and exchange and new culture has been creative, but it's been homogenizing, right? I think language is a really good example of this because language is a vehicle of culture. And language tourism is certainly a thing. People do come to different places to learn languages.
Interesting.
Yeah, so tourism can be a really good benefit by again providing kind of the economic scaffolding for cultural preservation and transmission through storytelling, through language use, through again, even just like upkeep of sites like that are historically significant, right? So, unlocking this form of economic activity that can then be directed towards conserving what makes a place unique and distinctive, and again, telling those stories that are a fundamental part of a community's sense of self, and sense of place and sense of being for the next generation.
And it strikes me when you say these things that tourism isn't always about people coming in to visit, or sometimes it's about communities getting to know themselves, telling the stories to themselves,
Yes.
creating a story of themselves, right? And
Hmm.
I mean, just to give you a random example, a couple of days ago, my sister attended my nephew's multicultural night, or her kids, I shouldn't say my nephew, my niece and nephew's multicultural night at their school, where they got to experience different foods from different places around the world, dances, other things. And a lot of those were put on by groups that are local. There's, a very large Indian population in just south of me in Canton, Michigan. So it strikes me that tourism is also about looking into yourself and looking and telling that story about yourself, and that brings people together around the story that they're telling.
1,000%, and I am so glad that you raised that point. Tourism, and I think when we think of tourism, we think of other places, right? But all tourism development is local development, and it can be definitely thought of and should be thought of as a form of community planning, right? Because you're aligning all of these different sectors to make sure that they're acting in concert, there is a getting to know oneself process, right? It's
Mhm.
when you have that intentionality of like yes we understand that like either visitors are coming or visitors can come, maybe you're developing a brand, within that process you are having a conversation with yourself of who are we, what do we value, what makes us distinct, and what do we represent, and what do we want to broadcast, what do we want to share. And so it's so powerful for building a sense of community, bringing stakeholders together, coordinating, and again, tourism done well makes the destination a better place to live in, right? The entire point is for the people who live there to benefit, right? And
Yeah.
visitors are guests, and it's using hosting as a way to improve the place that and one of the major intangible benefits is the connectivity and the sense of self. I encourage everybody to start exploring their own backyard because you would be amazed. You would be amazed what you can find.
I mean, I lived in Michigan most of my life, and I didn't know half the stuff that you've showed me with your map of Michigan and all the destinations.
Yeah, well, it's so funny that you mentioned that because that's actually how I got into this. Because because again, tourism again is not really understood popularly very well. The wonderful thing about tourism is it's coordinating different.
Interdisciplinary.
It's gosh, that's an understatement. It's extremely interdisciplinary, and I applied that lens immediately to Michigan, where we're from, right? I think Michiganders in particular have a love of our state, right?
I think so.
As all Midwesterners do, but I think we also don't understand just how layered and complex and quite frankly interesting of a place it is. And I
Really
remember,
interesting.
yeah, and I remember with my family, my aunt one day had said, she went through a hard time with the 2008 crisis here in Michigan, and she was like, I would just like love to take a vacation, but like a vacation is like a place. It's the Bahamas. It's someplace far away. It's hard. And
Right.
I was like, you know what? There's so much in our own backyard to be discovered. We just need the connectivity. We need the infrastructure. We need the storytelling. We need the intentionality.
Yeah.
And so that experience, that anecdote with also kind of the international development perspective that I was coming from kind of came together serendipitously. Yeah, and that's how I kind of fell into it.
And that's why you do it. Is that why you do tourism or why you continue to focus on it?
Yes, because it marries so much of what I love together. I love the storytelling aspect. I love the stakeholder engagement and the connecting. I mean, I love talking with people. I'm not sure if it's come across in this podcast, but I do. I do love talking with people and kind of understanding, know, where they're at, what they think, what they want for themselves and their communities. I think and I actually love destinations that are not necessarily always thought of as like at the forefront. Again, there's like sexy destinations like your Las Vegas or your Monaco or Barcelona,
Yeah.
right? Places like, oh, like I don't know, Nebraska. Nebraska is actually really interesting if you dig into it. Omaha is really cool. They do a lot. They do a lot. I encourage everybody to look into.
Right. If I want to create some kind of plan, and I'm a community developer, DDA, or maybe just a museum, and I have this idea of a kind of way that I want to develop the tourism, but I don't know how. I've never done it. I want to do it with intentionality. How can I engage someone like you? What do you do?
Right. So, I mean, I think the best way to do that would mean I wouldn't be shy about reaching out directly and just sort of explaining where you are and the idea that you have and where you would like to go. And then someone like myself or my colleagues, maybe me and my colleagues together could develop a plan for you with that is realistic and achievable for reaching those goals. So that could be developing an actionable planning framework. That could be, understanding what are the structural obstacles for developing your destination, what sort of financing paths are available for you within your specific destination, and what sort of resources that can be activated and yeah, go from there.
How can I reach out to you? How can I reach you?
Yeah, so I think the best way is just an email. Reach out to me at it's wilsonkr14 at Gmail. So that's just me. I operate as an independent consultant.
People can also reach you through Be Global by Design. You're a founding member. They can find your logo and information on our website, and it will also be linked in the bio if they want to reach out to you, follow up with you on any of these ideas. Yeah,
Yes, absolutely. I would welcome that.
that's awesome. Thank you, Christopher, for being with us today. Thank you for talking to me about this. It's been a pleasure to have you on here.
No, thank you so much for having me. It's been really exciting. I think I mentioned this before our podcast is that this is the first podcast I've ever done. Thank you for gently guiding me through the process. I really appreciate it.
We're all new to all this new stuff. So, yeah, thanks for being here. It was great to talk to you.
You as well, Kristen.